The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Florence, Arizona Territory, 1879. Marianne O'Sullivan clutched her small leather satchel tightly to her chest, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild mustang. Blood trickled from her split lip, where Victor Blackstone's signet ring had caught her face the final insult before she'd made her desperate escape. Behind her lay everything she had ever known. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the fading light of day. Marianne had been promised to Victor since she was 16 a business arrangement between her father's failing mining company and the Blackstone empire. Now, at 20, her wedding day had arrived, and with it came the horrifying revelation of the man she was truly meant to marry. When Victor had struck her for questioning the terms of their marriage contract, she knew she could not spend a lifetime as his possession. The evening stage had departed hours ago, and with it, her planned escape. Now she moved through the growing shadows, keeping to the edges of town, desperately searching for anywhere to hide until she could formulate a new plan. The sound of approaching horses sent her ducking into an alleyway between the general store and the blacksmith shop. "I'm telling you, she can't have gone far," Victor's voice carried on the cooling air. "$500 to the man who brings her back to me." Unmarked, Marianne pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, willing herself to become invisible as lantern lights swept past her hiding place. When the voices and hoofbeats faded, she released the breath she'd been holding and slipped toward the back of the alley. "You're in a mighty fine predicament, aren't you, miss?" The voice startled her so badly she nearly cried out. A tall figure leaned against the back wall of the blacksmith shop, the ember of a cigarette illuminating a face half hidden beneath the wide brim of a cowboy hat. "Please," Marianne whispered. "I can explain, no need." The man straightened, dropping the cigarette and crushing it beneath his boot heel. "I recognize trouble when I see it, and old man Blackstone's son tends to cause more than his fair share." He stepped forward, and Marianne could make out more of his features now: strong jawline, eyes that seemed to catch what little light remained in the day. "Name's Zachary Griffith. Most folks call me Zach. I'm Marianne O'Sullivan." "Pleased to meet you, Miss O'Sullivan, though I'd say the circumstances could be better." He glanced toward the street. "Those men will be back, and they'll be more thorough next time. You got somewhere to go?" Marianne shook her head, fighting back tears. "No, nowhere." Zach studied her for a long moment, then nodded once as if coming to a decision. "My ranch is about 10 miles outside of town. Not much to look at, but it's safe. You'd be welcome to stay until you figure out your next move. Why would you help me?" Marianne asked, suspicion warring with desperate hope. "Let's just say I've had my own run-ins with the Blackstone family, and I've never been one to leave a lady in distress." He removed his hat briefly, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll come to no harm under my roof." The sound of men shouting from the main street made the decision for her. "I accept your offer, Mr. Griffith. Then we best be moving. My horse is tied out back." Within minutes, Marianne found herself seated behind Zach on a powerful bay gelding, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist as they rode away from Florence under the cover of darkness. The horse moved confidently through terrain that was invisible to her eyes, but Zach seemed to know every rock and cactus by heart. "We'll need to stay off the main roads," he explained over his shoulder. "Blackstone's men will be watching them." "How do you know these back trails so well?" she asked, her voice bouncing with the rhythm of the horse. "Used to ride for the Pony Express before the war, and after that, well, let's just say I've had reason to avoid the main roads a time or two myself." They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the steady breathing of the horse and the occasional call of a night bird. Finally, Zach spoke again. "Just over this rise. You'll see the place soon." When they crested the small hill, Marianne could make out a modest ranch house nestled against a stand of cottonwood trees. A small barn stood nearby, and what appeared to be corrals stretched out behind it. No lights burned in the windows, giving the place a deserted appearance. "Do you live here alone?" she asked as Zach helped her dismount. "Just me and about 20 head of cattle, and Duke." At her questioning look, he explained, "My dog. Don't worry, he's friendly once he knows you're with me." As if on cue, a large black and white border collie came bounding from the direction of the house, barking enthusiastically. At a word from Zach, the dog quieted and approached Marianne with cautious interest. "Let him sniff your hand," Zach advised, leading his horse toward the small barn. "He'll be your best friend by morning." Marianne did as instructed, and the dog's cold nose tickled her palm before he apparently decided she was acceptable and trotted after his master. She followed them both to the barn, where Zach efficiently unsaddled and brushed down his mount. "I'm sorry for the trouble," she said softly, watching him work. "I know this is an imposition." "No trouble." Zach hung the saddle on a rack and turned to face her. In the dim light of the barn lantern, she could see his features more clearly: a straight nose, slightly crooked as if it had been broken once, and eyes the color of strong coffee. Not classically handsome, perhaps, but something about his face inspired trust. "Though I reckon you haven't eaten since morning. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and bacon." The ranch house was simple but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a small bedroom that Zach immediately assigned to her, and what appeared to be a storeroom. As promised, he prepared a simple meal while Marianne washed her face and hands at the basin he provided. "You mentioned you had dealings with the Blackstones before," she said as they ate at his small table. "May I ask what happened?" Zach's expression darkened momentarily. "Victor's father, Harrison Blackstone, has been trying to buy up all the water rights in this part of the territory. My land has one of the few year-round springs that hasn't dried up in summer. He offered to buy me out 3 years ago. When I refused, things got unpleasant." "Unpleasant how?" "Cattle went missing. Fences got cut. My barn mysteriously caught fire last summer." He shrugged, but Marianne could see the tension in his shoulders. Nothing that could be traced back to him, of course, but everyone knows who was behind it. "That's terrible," Marianne said, her appetite suddenly diminished. "My father told me the Blackstones were respected businessmen." "They're respected because they're feared," Zach corrected, "and they've got half the county officials in their pocket." He paused, studying her face. "Is that how you came to be promised to Victor?" "Your father owed them money," Marianne nodded, feeling ashamed though she knew the arrangement hadn't been her doing. "My father's mine stopped producing 2 years ago. He took loans from Harrison Blackstone to try another shaft, but it was no use. When he couldn't pay, Mr. Blackstone suggested an alternative arrangement." She touched her split lip unconsciously. "I'd never spent much time with Victor before the engagement. He was always polite, until today." Zach's jaw tightened. "Some men show their true nature only when they think they own you. I realized that too late." Tears threatened again, and Marianne blinked them back. "My father died 6 months ago. The wedding was delayed for mourning, but my mother insisted we honor his arrangement. She believed it was the only way to save us from destitution." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Now I've dishonored his memory and left my mother to face the consequences alone." "You did what you had to do," Zach said firmly. "A woman isn't cattle to be traded for debt. And no man has the right to raise his hand to his wife or anyone else." His vehemence surprised her, but she found comfort in it. Thank you for understanding, for helping. Get some rest, he said, rising to clear the plates. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next. That night, in the narrow bed of Zach's spare room, Marianne slept fitfully, dreaming of Victor's face twisted in rage and the sound of hoofbeats in pursuit. But when she woke with a start, the only sounds were the gentle chorus of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. Dawn came early on the ranch. Marianne rose with the first light, finding Zach already up and tending to his chores. She insisted on helping prepare breakfast, discovering that his pantry, while basic, contained enough supplies to make a decent meal of flapjacks and coffee. "You cook better than I do," Zach observed as they ate. "Haven't had flapjacks this good since my mother was alive. It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Marianne hesitated, then asked, "How long do you think I can stay here before it becomes dangerous for you?" Zach considered this as he sipped his coffee. "Blackstone's men will be searching, but they'll start with the stage stops and neighboring towns. They won't immediately think to look at my place. There's no love lost between our families. Still, we should be careful. No trips to town, no visitors." "I don't want to put you at risk," Marianne said. "Perhaps I should continue on to Tucson. I could find work there, perhaps as a seamstress or—" "And how would you get there?" Zach interrupted. "It's 60 miles through desert and mountain passes. Blackstone's men will be watching every road and stage station. No, the safest place for you right now is here, where no one will think to look." His expression softened. "Unless my company is that unbearable." "No, of course not," Marianne said quickly. "You've been nothing but kind. I just—" She struggled to articulate her feelings. "I've spent my whole life being told what to do, where to go, who to marry. For once, I want to make my own choices." "And you will," Zach assured her. "But sometimes the wise choice is to wait for the right moment." He stood, placing his hat on his head. "I need to check on the herd. Would you like to come along? Might do you good to get some fresh air." The day passed more quickly than Marianne expected. Zach showed her around the ranch, introducing her to his small herd of Hereford cattle and teaching her how to approach the gentler ones without frightening them. Duke, the border collie, shadowed their every move, occasionally racing off to investigate something in the brush before returning to Marianne's side as if appointed her personal guardian. As the days stretched into a week, they fell into an easy routine. Zach attended to the ranch work while Marianne took over the cooking and helped with whatever tasks she could manage. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zach sometimes telling stories of his days riding for the Pony Express or his time prospecting in the mountains before he settled on ranching. "What about your family?" Marianne asked one evening as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. "You mentioned your mother, but you never speak of anyone else." "Not much to tell," Zach replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Father died when I was 12, mining accident near Virginia City. Mother raised me and my sister on her own until the consumption took her when I was 17. Clara, my sister, married a shopkeeper in Sacramento. Haven't seen her in nearly 8 years, though we write occasionally." "I'm sorry about your parents," Marianne said softly. "It must have been difficult losing them both so young." "Life out here is seldom easy," he acknowledged with a shrug that didn't quite mask the old pain. "But it shapes you, makes you who you are." He glanced at her. "What about you? Any siblings?" "2 brothers, both older. Thomas works for the railroad in San Francisco. James joined the Army and was killed at Little Bighorn 3 years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," Zach said sincerely. "We weren't close," Marianne admitted. "They were so much older. Thomas is 32 now, and James would have been 29. They were already gone from home by the time I was old enough to really know them." And your mother, will she be all right without you? Marianne considered this. She'll be shocked at first, perhaps even ashamed of what I've done. But my Aunt Live's in Denver mother can go to her if the scandal becomes too great. And honestly, I think she only pushed for the marriage because she felt obligated to honor father's arrangement. She never seemed to care for Victor much herself. They lapsed into comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, revealing a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Marianne had seen in town. Out here, with no other lights to compete, the Milky Way spread across the heavens like spilled cream. It's beautiful, she breathed, tilting her head back to take in the vastness above them. One of the reasons I could never live in a city, Zach agreed. Too many buildings, not enough sky. As they sat there, Marianne became acutely aware of his presence beside her, the clean scent of soap and leather that always seemed to surround him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his arm almost, but didn't quite touch hers on the narrow porch bench. A strange feeling fluttered in her stomach, not entirely unpleasant but decidedly unsettling. I should turn in, she said abruptly, rising from her seat. Good night, Zach. If he noticed her sudden discomfort, he gave no sign. Sleep well, Marianne. That night, her dreams were different, not filled with fear and pursuit, but with confused images of strong hands and coffee-colored eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. The next morning, Marianne woke to the sound of voices outside the house. Alarmed, she hurriedly dressed and peered out the bedroom window to see Zach conversing with another man on horseback. For a terrifying moment, she thought Victor's men had found her, but then she noticed the star pinned to the visitor's vest. She waited until the man rode away before emerging from the bedroom. Zach stood at the kitchen table, his expression troubled. Who was that? Marianne asked, though she already suspected the answer. Sheriff Dawson, Zach confirmed. He's riding to all the outlying ranches, showing a sketch of you and asking if anyone's seen you. Marianne sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Did he suspect anything? I don't think so. Told him I've been too busy with the herd to notice strangers passing through. Zach sat across from her. But this confirms what we feared. They're widening the search. Blackstone's offering $1,000 now for information on your whereabouts. $1,000. Marianne felt ill. That kind of money would tempt even honest men in this hard-scrabble territory. I should leave. Tonight. I can't put you at risk any longer. And go where? Zach demanded. Every lawman in the territory will have your description by now. I don't know, Marianne cried, frustration and fear overwhelming her. But I can't stay here forever, hiding like a criminal when I've done nothing wrong. No, you can't, Zach agreed, surprising her. He leaned forward, his expression intense. But what if there was a way to resolve this legally? A way that would free you from Victor Blackstone for good? What do you mean? Sheriff Dawson mentioned something interesting. Seems that after you disappeared, several other women came forward with stories about Victor Blackstone. Ugly stories that his father has been paying to keep quiet for years. Zach's jaw tightened. One girl died last year officially from falling downstairs, but the doctor had his suspicions. With enough testimonies, the territorial judge might be persuaded to look into the matter. Hope flickered briefly in Marianne's heart, only to be extinguished by reality. It won't work. The Blackstones control everything in this county. Even if women were brave enough to testify, who would believe them over a respected businessman? Judge McAllister is new to the territory, Zach argued. Appointed directly by the governor, not elected locally. They say he's honest, a rarity in these parts. But how would we even reach him? I can't exactly walk into the courthouse. Zach stood and began pacing the small kitchen. I know someone, a lawyer in Tucson, who handles land disputes. He's helped me fend off Blackstone's attempts to seize my water rights. If anyone would know how to approach the judge safely, it would be him." "You do that?" Marianne asked, almost afraid to hope. "You've already risked so much for me." Zach paused in his pacing, his gaze meeting hers. "Marianne, He seemed to struggle for words, then simply said, "Yes, I do that, and more if necessary." Something in his expression made that strange, fluttering return to her stomach. She looked away, suddenly flustered. "How would you contact this lawyer?" "I'll need to go to town," Zach said, returning to practical matters. "Send a telegram, but I'll have to be careful. Blackstone's men will be watching." "When will you go?" "Tomorrow. Market day. The town will be crowded, easier to blend in." He glanced out the window at the position of the sun. "Meanwhile, I need to finish mending that fence in the north pasture before dark. Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" "Of course," Marianne assured him, though the thought of being alone suddenly seemed less appealing than it had a week ago. "I'll have Duke for company." As if hearing his name, the border collie trotted into the kitchen and sat expectantly at her feet. Zach smiled at the sight. "Traitor," he told the dog good-naturedly. "Used to be I was the only one you'd beg from." "He knows I'm softer-hearted than you," Marianne replied, slipping the dog a scrap of bacon from breakfast. "Go on with your work. We'll be fine." After Zach left, Marianne busied herself with chores, trying to ignore the growing unease that had nothing to do with fear of discovery, and everything to do with her conflicted feelings about the cowboy who had become her protector. She had known him barely 10 days, yet somehow he had come to occupy a space in her thoughts that no man, certainly not Victor, had ever touched. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Duke suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Marianne asked, scanning the horizon. The dog stood, hackles raised, staring intently toward the road that led from town. A plume of dust in the distance confirmed her fears. Riders approaching. Marianne hurried inside, her heart racing. Through the window, she counted 3 horsemen coming up the long drive to the ranch house. None of them was Zach. Duke continued to growl, positioning himself between Marianne and the door. She looked around frantically for a weapon, finding only a cast-iron skillet. It would have to do. She gripped the heavy pan and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, praying that the men would leave when they found the house apparently empty. The sound of boots on the porch steps sent a chill down her spine. Then a familiar voice called out, "Hello, anybody home?" "Griffith, you in there?" Marianne nearly collapsed with relief. It was Sheriff Dawson's voice, not one of Blackstone's men. Still, she remained silent, uncertain whether the sheriff was alone or if the other riders might be in Victor's employ. "Place looks deserted," another voice said. "Probably out with his cattle." "Let's check the barn," the sheriff suggested. "He mentioned he'd be working on his stock today." The footsteps retreated, and Marianne allowed herself to breathe. They hadn't forced entry, which suggested they weren't actively searching the house. Perhaps this was just a follow-up to the sheriff's earlier visit. She crept to the window that faced the barn, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. The 3 men, the sheriff, and 2 deputies, judging by their badges, were making their way toward the outbuildings. If they searched thoroughly enough, they would eventually find signs that Zach wasn't living alone. Her half-finished mending sat openly on a chair, and women's laundry hung on the line out back. Making a split-second decision, Marianne slipped out the back door. If she could circle around to warn Zach before the lawmen found him, perhaps they could concoct a story that wouldn't immediately raise suspicions. Duke followed silently at her heels, seeming to understand the need for stealth. The north pasture was a good 15-minute walk from the house, and Marianne moved as quickly as she dared through the brush, trying to avoid the more open areas where she might be spotted from a distance. The dress she wore, one of her own that she'd brought in her small satchel, was impractical for this kind of movement, catching on thorns and restricting her stride. She mentally vowed that if she survived this ordeal, she would invest in a pair of practical trousers like the ranch women sometimes wore beneath their skirts. She found Zach exactly where he'd said he would be, hammering a loose rail back into place on the pasture fence. He looked up in surprise as she approached, his expression quickly shifting to alarm when he saw her state. "What's happened?" he asked, dropping the hammer and striding toward her. "Sheriff Dawson and 2 deputies," Marianne explained breathlessly. "At the house. Looking for you. I slipped out before they could see me, but they'll find evidence I've been staying there." Zach cursed under his breath, then took her arm and led her toward a small stand of trees. "Stay here. I'll go back and talk to them, try to throw them off the scent." "What will you tell them?" "That depends on what they already know. Just stay hidden, and if I don't come back within 2 hours, head west through the wash. There's an old line shack about 3 miles that way." He hesitated, then impulsively took her hand. "I won't let them take you back to Blackstone, I promise." Before Marianne could respond, he was gone, moving swiftly back toward the ranch house. Duke whined, clearly torn between following his master and staying with her. "Go with him," she told the dog. "He might need you." The border collie needed no further encouragement, bounding after Zach with his tail low. Alone in the small copse of trees, Marianne sank to the ground, her back against a rough trunk, and waited. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Marianne found herself growing drowsy despite her anxiety. She struggled to stay alert, counting the minutes and straining to hear any sound of approach. Just as she was about to give up and seek better shelter from the heat, she heard footsteps approaching. She pressed herself more firmly against the tree trunk, trying to make herself as small as possible. Through the branches, she caught sight of a familiar figure, Zach, walking slowly but purposefully toward her hiding place. "Alone. It's safe," he called softly. "They're gone." Marianne emerged from the trees, relief washing over her. "What happened? What did they want?" "Nothing good," Zach replied grimly. "One of Blackstone's men spotted me in town last week with supplies for 2, started rumors that I might be harboring a fugitive." His expression was troubled. "Sheriff Dawson doesn't seem convinced, but he felt obligated to check it out." "Did they search the house?" "No, thank God. Just asked a lot of questions about whether I'd seen any strangers passing through." Zach ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Marianne had come to recognize as a sign of stress. "I played dumb, said I'd been too busy with the ranch to notice much of anything. Claimed the extra supplies were because I'm expecting my sister to visit next month. And they believed you, for now, but they'll be watching more closely." He met her gaze directly. "This changes things, Marianne. My trip to town tomorrow would be too risky now. They'll be keeping an eye on me." Disappointment crashed over her. "So we're back where we started, hiding and hoping not to be discovered." "Not exactly." Zach's expression shifted to one of determination. "I have another idea. It's risky, but it might be our only option at this point." "What is it?" "We need to get you to Tucson, to my lawyer friend directly. He can help you file for protection from the court and make a formal complaint against Blackstone." "But how? You said yourself the roads are being watched." "There's an old Apache trail through the mountains. It's rough going, but it would bypass all the main roads and settlements. We could be in Tucson in 3 days if we push hard." Marianne questioned. "You'd come with me, of course," Zach said, as if surprised she would think otherwise. "I wouldn't send you alone into that kind of terrain. Besides, you'd need someone to vouch for you when you reach the lawyer." Marianne considered the plan. It was desperate, certainly, but perhaps no more desperate than continuing to hide at the ranch with Blackstone's men closing in. "When would we leave?" "Tonight, under cover of darkness. We'll take my 2 best horses and travel light." Zach's gaze softened. "It won't be comfortable, Marianne. The trail is rough and we'll have to sleep under the stars." "I'm not afraid of discomfort," she assured him. "I'm more afraid of what awaits me if Victor finds me." Zach nodded, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. "Then we'd best get back to the house and prepare. We have a lot to do before sundown." The preparations took longer than expected. They packed only essentials, food that wouldn't spoil, canteens of water, a change of clothes each, and bedrolls. Zach added a rifle in a saddle scabbard and a revolver that he insisted Marianne learn to use before they departed. "I've never fired a gun before," she protested, as he positioned her hands on the weapon. "Pray you never need to," Zach replied, standing close behind her to guide her aim. "But if it comes to it, I want you to be able to defend yourself." His proximity was distracting, the solid warmth of his chest against her back making it difficult to concentrate on his instructions. When she finally squeezed the trigger, and the gun they were using as a target went flying, she was almost as surprised as she was pleased. "Good shot," Zach said approvingly, stepping back. "Now try it on your own." By the time darkness fell, Marianne had become reasonably proficient with the revolver, and they had packed everything they would need for the journey. As Zach saddled the horses, Marianne took one last look around the small ranch house that had become her sanctuary over the past days. "Having second thoughts?" Zach asked, noticing her wistful expression. "No," she said firmly. "Just saying goodbye, I suppose. This is the first place since my father died where I've felt truly safe." Zach paused in adjusting a saddle strap. "If all goes well in Tucson, you can come back. Once Blackstone is dealt with legally, I mean." "Would you want me to?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. In the dim light of the barn lantern, Marianne saw something flicker across Zach's face, an emotion quickly masked. "That would be your choice to make, not anyone else's." The reminder of her newfound freedom and his respect for it touched her deeply. "Thank you, Zach, for everything." He merely nodded, returning his attention to the horses. "We should go. The moon won't rise for another hour, and we need to be well away from here by then." They set out under a canopy of stars, riding single file with Zach leading the way. Duke had been left behind with enough food for several days, a necessary precaution, as the dogs' barking might give them away if they encountered trouble on the trail. The first few hours passed in tense silence as they put distance between themselves and the ranch, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main trail whenever possible. Only when they reached the foothills of the mountains did Zach signal for a brief rest. "We're beyond the areas they'll search first," he explained as they dismounted to let the horses drink from a small stream. "But we should keep moving. I want to reach the high pass before dawn." The trail grew steeper as they ascended into the mountains, sometimes narrowing to a track barely wide enough for the horses to pass single file. In these sections, Marianne had to fight against vertigo as she glimpsed the drop-offs to one side, visible as deeper patches of blackness in the dark night. The Apache used these trails for centuries. Zach told her quietly when they paused again to rest the horses. "They know how to move through terrain white men consider impassable." "How do you know the way?" Marianne asked. Zach's expression was difficult to read in the darkness. "I had an Apache friend once, Nahilze. He taught me some of their paths when I first came to this territory, before the reservations." A note of sadness entered his voice. "He died in the last uprising, fighting for land that should have been his by right." "I'm sorry," Marianne said, genuinely moved by the loss she heard in his voice. It was years ago now. Zach shook his head as if to dispel old memories. The point is, very few white men know these trails exist, let alone how to follow them. Blackstone's men will be watching the roads and passes, not looking for us up here. They continued through the night, the terrain growing increasingly challenging. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Marianne was exhausted, her body aching from hours in the saddle and the constant tension of navigating treacherous paths in darkness. "There," Zach pointed ahead as they rounded a bend in the trail. "That's the high pass. Once we're through, we'll find a place to rest for a few hours." The pass itself was a narrow gap between towering rock formations, barely wide enough for a single rider. As they approached, Marianne felt a growing sense of unease. The place seemed too perfect for an ambush, though she tried to dismiss the thought as paranoia born of fatigue. Zach must have had similar concerns, for he reined in his horse and dismounted. "Wait here," he instructed, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "I'll check ahead." Marianne watched anxiously as he moved forward on foot, carefully scanning the rocks on either side of the pass. When he finally signaled for her to follow, she released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "All clear?" she asked as she caught up to him. "Seems to be. No fresh tracks, at least." He remounted but kept his rifle across his lap rather than returning it to the scabbard. "Stay close." They passed through the gap without incident, emerging onto a plateau that offered a stunning view of the valley below, now visible in the growing light. In the far distance, Marianne could make out what might be the spire of a church or courthouse civilization, though still a day's ride away. Zach led them to a sheltered hollow where a small spring bubbled from the rocks, creating a patch of greenery in the otherwise barren landscape. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he decided, helping Marianne dismount. "There's good water and shade, and we can see anyone approaching from below." Too tired to argue, Marianne sank onto the ground beneath a scrubby juniper tree, watching as Zach efficiently unsaddled the horses and set them to graze on the sparse vegetation. When he offered her jerky and hardtack from their provisions, she accepted gratefully, only now realizing how hungry she was. "Try to sleep," Zach advised when they had eaten. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Marianne protested, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes. "I'll wake you in a few hours and take my turn then," he promised, settling himself against a rock with a clear view of the trail they had ascended. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive for Marianne. Each time she began to drift off, some sound would startle her back to wakefulness: the cry of a hawk, the rustle of wind through the junipers, the occasional snort or stamping of the horses. Finally, she gave up and moved to sit beside Zach. "Can't sleep?" he asked, glancing at her with concern. "Too many unfamiliar sounds," she admitted. "And too many thoughts." "Want to talk about them?" Marianne hesitated, unsure how to articulate the swirl of emotions within her. "I keep thinking about what happens after Tucson. If we succeed, if the judge grants me protection from Victor, what then? I have no home, no family nearby, no means of support." "You'd have options," Zach said. "Your mother's sister in Denver, for one." "Yes, I suppose. Or I could seek employment somewhere, San Francisco, perhaps, where my brother might help me find a position." Neither prospect filled her with enthusiasm. "Or," Zach said after a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, "you could come back to Florence, to the ranch." Marianne's heart gave a peculiar skip. "As your housekeeper, you mean, if that's what you'd want?" He turned to look at her then, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Or as something more permanent, if you were inclined that way." "Zach, are you?" Marianne couldn't quite bring herself to finish the question. "Proposing?" A smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. "Not very well, it seems, and certainly not with any expectation. You've only just escaped one unwanted arrangement. The last thing you need is another man making claims." He shook his head. "Forget I said anything. It was presumptuous." "No," Marianne said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "It wasn't presumptuous, it was kind and unexpected." She looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. "I've grown very fond of you, Zach, more than fond. But everything has happened so quickly, and I'm still not sure who I am when I'm not being someone's daughter or someone's fiancée." "I understand," Zach said, and she believed he truly did. "There's no rush, Marianne. Whatever happens in Tucson, you'll have choices. Real ones this time." They sat in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, neither feeling the need to say more. When Marianne finally dozed off, her head came to rest naturally against Zach's shoulder. He remained still, unwilling to disturb her well-earned rest, even as his arm grew numb from the position. It was late afternoon when they resumed their journey, the worst heat of the day behind them. The trail now began a gradual descent toward the valley, still rough but less precarious than the ascent had been. Zach estimated they would reach the outskirts of Tucson by the following evening if they continued at a steady pace. As twilight fell, they made camp in another sheltered spot, this one beside a dry wash that showed signs of occasional water flow. After a simple meal, they spread their bedrolls near the small fire Zach had built for warmth, as the desert night was already growing cool. "Tell me about this lawyer friend of yours," Marianne requested as they sat watching the flames. "Will he really be able to help?" "Malcolm Hayes is a good man," Zach assured her. "Came west from Boston after the war with ideals about justice that somehow survived even in this territory. He's handled several cases against the Blackstone family, mostly land disputes, but a few more serious matters too." "And he's won?" Marianne asked skeptically. "Not always," Zach admitted, "but often enough that the Blackstones have put a bounty on his head twice. He considers that a mark of success." He smiled slightly. "Malcolm will help us, if only for the chance to bring down another Blackstone." "I hope you're right," Marianne said, drawing her blanket closer around her shoulders as the temperature continued to drop. "Because I don't know what I'll do if this doesn't work." "One step at a time," Zach advised. "For now, get some sleep. I'll take the first watch again." "Wake me for my turn this time," Marianne insisted. "You need rest too." Zach agreed, though Marianne suspected he might let her sleep through the night anyway. She was proven right when she woke to find the eastern sky already brightening and Zach still sitting by the remains of the fire, his rifle across his knees. "You didn't wake me," she accused, sitting up. "You needed the sleep more than I did," he replied unapologetically. "And who will guide us safely if you fall from your saddle from exhaustion?" Marianne countered, rising to stir the fire back to life. "Tonight, I insist on taking my turn at watch." Zach raised his hands in surrender. "Yes, madam." They broke camp quickly, eager to cover as much ground as possible before the day's heat became unbearable. The terrain grew more hospitable as they descended further, with patches of grass and scattered trees offering occasional shade. By midday, they had reached a small tributary of the San Pedro River, where they paused to water the horses and refill their canteens. "How much farther?" Marianne asked, splashing cool water on her face and neck. "We're making good time," Zach replied, studying the position of the sun. "Should reach the edge of Tucson by nightfall, but we'll wait until morning to enter the town itself. Easier to move unnoticed in daylight when the streets are crowded." They had just remounted and started along the riverbank when Zach suddenly reined in his horse, his head cocked as if listening. Marianne was about to ask what was wrong when she heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats, more than one horse, approaching from the direction they had come. "Could be anyone," she said hopefully. Travelers like us. Maybe, Zach conceded, but his expression was grim. But not many people use these old trails. He scanned their surroundings, quickly assessing options. This way, quickly. He led them away from the river into a thicket of mesquite and palo verde trees that offered some concealment. Dismounting, he signaled for Marianne to do the same, then led the horses deeper into the brush where they would be hidden from casual observation. "Stay here," he whispered, drawing his rifle. "I'm going to get a look at our visitors." "Be careful," Marianne urged, her heart racing. Zach moved silently back toward the river, keeping low and using the vegetation for cover. Marianne waited anxiously, straining to hear over the pounding of her own pulse in her ears. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed, suggesting the riders had reached the spot where they had stopped to rest. Minutes stretched like hours before Zach finally returned, his expression confirming her worst fears. "Blackstone's men," she whispered. "3 of them, including that foreman of his Jackson." Zach's voice was tight with tension. "They're following our trail. Must have picked it up near the ranch and tracked us through the pass." "How? You said no one knew these trails." "Someone does," Zach said grimly. "Or they have a tracker with them. Either way, they know we're ahead of them." He began checking his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "We need to move, and fast. If we can reach the outskirts of Tucson by nightfall, we might lose them in the settlements." They remounted quickly and set off at a pace that was faster than prudent given the terrain, but necessary under the circumstances. Zach led them on a winding path, sometimes doubling back or crossing rocky ground where tracks would be harder to follow. By mid-afternoon, Marianne's horse was lathered with sweat and clearly tiring. "We need to rest them," she called to Zach. "They can't keep this pace." Reluctantly, he agreed, leading them to a small arroyo where the horses could rest in what little shade the steep banks provided. While the animals recovered, Zach climbed to higher ground to scan their back trail. "I don't see them," he reported when he returned. "But that doesn't mean they've given up. Jackson is persistent, and he knows this territory almost as well as I do." "What if they catch up to us?" Marianne asked, voicing the fear that had been growing within her since they discovered they were being pursued. Zach's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. "I won't let them take you." The simple declaration, delivered without drama or elaboration, somehow meant more to Marianne than the most flowery vow of protection. She stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I won't let them hurt you either, Zach. This is my fight too." He covered her hand with his own, a fleeting touch that nevertheless sent warmth spreading through her. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that. If we can reach Hayes in Tucson, we'll have the law on our side." They resumed their journey with renewed determination, pushing onward as the afternoon waned. The terrain began to change subtly. More signs of human habitation appeared, from the occasional fence line to rutted wagon tracks crossing their path. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, they could see scattered lights in the distance, the outskirts of Tucson. "We'll make for that stand of cottonwoods," Zach decided, pointing to a dark cluster of trees about a half-mile ahead. "We can camp there for the night and enter town at first light." The small grove proved to be beside another tributary of the river, providing both water and concealment. Too exhausted to hunt, they made do with the last of their provisions: jerky, hardtack, and a handful of dried apples. Neither felt much like talking, the strain of the day's flight having taken its toll. As promised, Marianne took the first watch this time, insisting that Zach get some rest while she kept an eye on their back trail. He agreed with obvious reluctance, extracting a promise that she would wake him at the slightest sign of trouble. The night was quiet except for the usual desert sounds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. the occasional call of a night bird, the soft whickering of the horses as they grazed nearby. Marianne found herself fighting to stay awake as the adrenaline of the day's chase wore off, leaving her drained. She was just about to wake Zach for his turn when she noticed something that made her blood run cold, a faint glow in the distance, like lantern light, moving steadily in their direction. "Zach," she hissed, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up, they're coming." He was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle even as he sat up. "Where?" Marianne pointed to the distant lights, now clearly visible against the darkness. "They must have followed our trail even in the dark." "Damn persistent," Zach muttered. He quickly assessed their situation. "We have two options. We can try to outrun them, make a break for town now in the dark, or we can stand and fight here where we have some cover." "Would we reach town before they caught up to us?" Marianne asked, already knowing the answer. "Not likely. Not with our horses as tired as they are." Zach's expression was grim but determined. "It's your decision, Marianne. I'll follow your lead on this." She appreciated that he was giving her the choice, even as she wished the burden didn't fall to her. After a moment's thought, she said, "If we run, we'll be caught in the open. At least here we have some advantage." Zach nodded, already moving to secure the horses where they wouldn't be easily spotted. "I was hoping you'd say that. Get your revolver ready and find cover behind those rocks. I'll try to reason with them first, but if that fails—" "I understand," Marianne said, checking the weapon as he had taught her. They positioned themselves carefully, Zach behind a fallen log with a clear line of fire toward the approaching riders, Marianne among rocks several yards to his left, creating a crossfire if it came to that. As the riders drew nearer, Marianne could make out three distinct shapes against the night sky. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the revolver, but she forced herself to remember Zach's instructions. "Aim carefully. Squeeze, don't pull. Breathe through it." When the riders were within hailing distance, Zach called out, "That's far enough, Jackson. State your business." The approaching figures pulled up sharply, surprised by the challenge from the darkness. "Griffith," a rough voice responded. "Figured that was your trail we were following. Mr. Blackstone wants a word with you about some property of his you've taken." "Miss O'Sullivan isn't property," Zach replied evenly, "and she's under my protection. Turn around and ride back to your boss. Tell him she'll be filing formal charges with the territorial judge tomorrow." Harsh laughter greeted this declaration. "Judge won't help you, Griffith. Mr. Blackstone owns half the territory, including most of the law." "Not all of it," Zach countered, "and I'm willing to bet Judge McAllister can't be bought." There was a moment of tense silence before Jackson spoke again. "Hand over the girl, and Mr. Blackstone might be persuaded to forget about burning down your ranch while you've been gone." Marianne gasped softly at the threat, but Zach's voice remained steady. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, Jackson. This doesn't have to end badly for you." "Outnumbered?" Jackson scoffed. "It's 3 against 1, Griffith, unless you're counting the girl, and I doubt she even knows which end of a gun to hold." In answer, Marianne took careful aim at a rock near the leftmost rider and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, causing the man's horse to rear in alarm. "Jesus!" the rider cursed, struggling to control his mount. "There's someone else out there, last warning," Zach called. "Ride away now, or the next shot won't miss." For a tense moment, Marianne thought Jackson might actually retreat. Then she saw the center rider's arm move in a way that could only mean one thing: he was drawing his weapon. "Gun!" she shouted just as a shot exploded from Jackson's position. Zach fired almost simultaneously, and one of the riders cried out in pain. More gunfire erupted as the men scattered, seeking cover of their own. Marianne fired twice more, aiming toward muzzle flashes rather than at the men themselves, hoping to drive them back rather than kill. A bullet splintered the rock near her head, showering her with fragments. She ducked lower, heart pounding, trying to keep track of where everyone was in the darkness and confusion. "Marianne?" Zach's voice came from her right, closer than before. He must have moved positions after firing. "Are you hit?" "No," she called back, relieved to hear his voice. I'm fine. I think I winged Jackson, but they've taken cover behind those boulders." The shooting had momentarily ceased, creating an eerie quiet broken only by the labored breathing of someone in pain, one of Jackson's men, presumably. Then Jackson's voice called out from the darkness. "This is pointless, Griffith. Even if you kill all of us, Blackstone will just send more men. You can't win this fight." "Maybe not," Zach acknowledged. "But neither can you, Jackson. Not tonight. And by tomorrow, Miss O'Sullivan will be under the protection of the territorial court. Blackstone may own Florence, but his reach doesn't extend to the federal judge." A muttered conversation took place among the three men, too low for Marianne to make out the words. Then Jackson spoke again. "We're leaving, Griffith. But this isn't over. Mr. Blackstone doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." "Neither do I," Zach replied coldly. They listened as the sounds of retreating hoofbeats gradually faded into the distance. Even after they could no longer hear them, Zach insisted they maintain their positions for another half-hour, in case it was a ruse. When he finally signaled it was safe, Marianne emerged from her hiding place on legs that felt unsteady as a newborn colt's. Zach was at her side immediately, his face a mask of concern in the faint moonlight. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands gently checking her for injuries she might have missed in the heat of the moment. "I'm not hurt," she assured him, though she was trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "Just shaken." "You were brave," Zach said, his voice filled with admiration. "Most people freeze the first time they're shot at." "I was terrified," Marianne admitted, "but I couldn't let you face them alone." Their eyes met in the darkness, and something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words could express. Then Zach cleared his throat and stepped back. "We should move," he said, all business again. "They might have been telling the truth about leaving, but I wouldn't put it past Jackson to circle back once he thinks we've let our guard down." They quickly gathered their belongings and saddled the horses, neither wanting to remain at the site of the gunfight any longer than necessary. Instead of heading directly toward Tucson, Zach led them on a roundabout route, frequently checking their back trail to ensure they weren't being followed. It was well past midnight when they finally reached the outskirts of Tucson. Rather than trying to find lodging at such a late hour, which would inevitably raise questions they didn't want to answer, Zach guided them to another small grove of trees outside town. "We'll rest here until dawn," he decided. "Then go straight to Hayes's office when it opens. He lives above his practice, so he should be there early." Too exhausted to argue, Marianne simply nodded and dismounted. They made camp quickly, foregoing a fire that might draw unwanted attention. When Zach offered Marianne the last of their water, she accepted gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for the water, for everything. I wouldn't have survived this journey without you." "You're stronger than you think, Marianne," Zach replied. "You would have found a way." "Perhaps," she allowed, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then added, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past 2 weeks have changed me. I'm not the same woman who fled Florence in terror, and that's because of you." Zach seemed about to say something, then changed his mind. Instead, he simply touched her cheek briefly, a gesture so gentle it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be challenging enough." Despite her exhaustion, Marianne found sleep elusive once more. Her mind replayed the gunfight over and over, imagining all the ways it could have ended differently with Zach wounded or killed, with her dragged back to Victor Blackstone in chains. When she finally did drift off, her dreams were chaotic fragments of pursuit and fear. Dawn found her awake and watching the eastern sky lighten from indigo to pale blue. Beside her, Zach slept soundly for perhaps the first time since they'd left the ranch, his face relaxed in repose, making him look younger and less careworn. She allowed herself a moment to study him unobserved, the strong line of his jaw, the slight curve of his lips, the dark lashes resting against his cheeks. In that quiet moment, with the world still hushed around them, Marianne acknowledged to herself what she had been gradually realizing over the past days. She was falling in love with this man who had risked everything to help her. Not the desperate, clinging attachment of a rescued maiden to her savior, but something deeper and more genuine, a recognition of qualities she truly admired, and a companionship that felt like coming home. The realization should have frightened her, coming so soon after her narrow escape from one marriage. Instead, she found it brought a sense of peace. Whatever happened in Tucson today, whatever choices lay before her afterward, she would face them with clearer eyes and a stronger heart than she had possessed before meeting Zachary Griffith. When Zach finally stirred and opened his eyes, finding her watching him, a slow smile spread across his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "How long have you been awake?" "Not long," Marianne lied, returning his smile. "It's a beautiful morning." "It is," he agreed, sitting up and running a hand through his disheveled hair. "And hopefully the beginning of a better day than yesterday." He glanced toward Tucson, now visible in the distance as the sun illuminated adobe buildings and church spires. "We should get moving. Hayes is an early riser." They broke camp efficiently, packing away their few belongings and ensuring no trace of their presence remained. As they mounted up for the final leg of their journey, Marianne felt a strange mixture of hope and trepidation. By sunset, her fate might be decided one way or another. Tucson in 1879 was a bustling frontier town, a mix of Mexican and American influences evident in its architecture and population. As they rode down the main street, Marianne couldn't help but notice the curious glances directed their way. A dusty, travel-worn couple was apparently unusual enough to attract attention even in this diverse community. Hayes's law office was located on a side street near the courthouse, a modest adobe building with a painted wooden sign proclaiming Malcolm Hayes, attorney at law in somewhat faded letters. As Zach had predicted, there was a light already burning in the window despite the early hour. They secured their horses at a hitching post, and Zach helped Marianne down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "Ready?" he asked, studying her face. She nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Ready." Zach knocked firmly on the door, and they heard movement inside before it swung open to reveal a lean, scholarly-looking man with spectacles, and a neatly trimmed beard shot through with gray. His expression of mild inquiry shifted to one of surprise, and then pleasure as he recognized his visitor. "Zachary Griffith, as I live and breathe. What brings you two?" he broke off, noticing Marianne for the first time. "I see. Perhaps this is a conversation best continued inside." He ushered them into a cluttered but comfortable office, gesturing for them to take seats while he closed and locked the door behind them. "Coffee," he offered, already moving to a pot bubbling on a small stove in the corner. "Please," Zach accepted for both of them. "It's been a long journey, Malcolm, so I gather." Hayes poured 3 cups and distributed them before taking a seat behind his desk. "Now, why don't you introduce your companion and explain why you both look as if you've been riding hard for days?" "This is Miss Marianne O'Sullivan," Zach said formally. Marianne Malcolm Hayes, the finest legal mind in the Arizona Territory. You flatter me, but I detect ulterior motives, Hayes said dryly. Miss O'Sullivan, it's a pleasure to meet you, though I suspect the circumstances are less than pleasant. Mr. Hayes, Marianne acknowledged with a nod. I'm afraid you're right about the circumstances. Between them, she and Zach recounted the events of the past 2 weeks, her flight from Victor Blackstone, Zach's offer of sanctuary, the pursuit that had led them to Tucson. Hayes listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification, but otherwise allowing them to tell their story without interruption. When they had finished, he removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully before responding. You've certainly handed me an interesting case, Miss O'Sullivan. The Blackstone family is not an opponent to be taken lightly. Can you help her? Zach asked directly. Hayes replaced his spectacles and leaned forward, his expression serious. I believe so, yes. There are several legal avenues we might pursue. First and most immediate would be a restraining order to prevent Victor Blackstone from approaching or contacting you. Judge McAllister takes a dim view of violence against women, regardless of social standing. Would that be enough to keep her safe? Zach pressed. It's a start, Hayes replied. But for more lasting protection, we would need to formally invalidate any claim Blackstone believes he has on Miss O'Sullivan. That might involve challenging the legitimacy of the arranged marriage contract itself. My father signed it, Marianne said quietly. It seemed legally binding. Perhaps not, Hayes mused. The territorial courts have been inconsistent in their enforcement of such arrangements, particularly when there are questions about coercion or undue influence. You mentioned your father was in significant debt to Harrison Blackstone when he agreed to the match. Yes, Marianne confirmed. The mine had failed, and he had borrowed heavily to try to save it. That could work in our favor. We might argue that the marriage contract was extracted under duress, as a form of debt collection rather than a genuine marital arrangement. Hayes made a few notes on a pad before him. Additionally, the fact that Victor physically assaulted you prior to the wedding provides grounds to void any agreement, regardless of how it was obtained. So there's hope, Marianne asked, scarcely daring to believe it might be that simple. There's always hope, my dear, Hayes assured her with a gentle smile. Though I won't pretend it will be easy. The Blackstones wield considerable influence, even here in Tucson. But Judge McAllister is, as Zachary suggested, a man of integrity. If we present our case properly, I believe he will rule in your favor. How soon can we get before the judge? Zach asked, clearly eager to resolve the matter quickly. That's the good news, Hayes replied. The judge is currently hearing cases here in Tucson, a rare occurrence, as he usually circuits through the territory. With a matter as pressing as this, involving potential danger to a young woman, I believe I can secure an emergency hearing as early as tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. Marianne echoed, relief and anxiety warring within her. So soon? The sooner the better, I should think, Hayes said. Unless you have objections. No, she said quickly. No objections, I didn't expect things to move so quickly. Justice delayed is often justice denied, Miss O'Sullivan, particularly when powerful interests are involved. Hayes rose from his desk. Now, you both look in need of rest and refreshment. I suggest you take rooms at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. It's just down the street, and the proprietor is a friend who can be trusted to be discreet about your presence. Is that safe? Zach asked. Blackstone's men reached Tucson before us. They could be watching. A valid concern, Hayes acknowledged. But the Cosmopolitan has a private entrance from the alley, and Mrs. Fernandez is quite adept at handling unwanted visitors. I'll accompany you there myself and make the arrangements. Once you're settled, I'll begin preparing the necessary documents for tomorrow's hearing." As they left the law office, Marianne felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since fleeing Florence, she could glimpse a future beyond mere survival, a future where she might truly be free to make her own choices. The Cosmopolitan Hotel proved to be a pleasant surprise, a two-story adobe structure with clean, comfortable rooms and a surprisingly good restaurant on the ground floor. As Hayes had promised, Mrs. Fernandez, the no-nonsense proprietress, showed them to adjoining rooms accessible via a private staircase at the back of the building. "No one will disturb you here," she assured them in accented English. "Malcolm has explained the situation. If anyone comes asking questions, they will find no answers from me or my staff." Once they were alone in the corridor between their rooms, an awkward silence fell between Marianne and Zach. After days of constant proximity and shared danger, the prospect of separation, even just for a few hours, felt strangely unsettling. "You should rest," Zach finally said, breaking the silence. "Tomorrow will be challenging." "Will you be there?" Marianne asked. "At the hearing, I mean." "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "If you want me there." "I do," she said simply. "Very much." Something flickered in his eyes, hope perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't ready to name. "Then I'll be there." Hayes said he'd return at sunset to discuss the details of the hearing and have us sign the necessary papers. "Zach," Marianne began, then faltered, unsure how to express the tumult of feelings within her. "I just wanted to say, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever I decide to do afterward, I'll never forget what you've done for me." "You don't owe me anything, Marianne," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." "I do know that," she assured him, "and it's one of the many reasons I—" She hesitated, then chose safer words than the ones in her heart. "One of the many reasons I'm grateful it was you who found me that night in Florence." Zach studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for something in her expression. Then he nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and restraint. "Get some rest," he said again, softer this time. "I'll see you at sunset." In her room, Marianne found a copper tub had been filled with steaming water and clean towels laid out on the bed. The simple luxury of a hot bath after days on the trail was almost enough to bring her to tears. She soaked until the water cooled, washing away the dust and sweat of their journey, trying not to think too far ahead or about the man in the room next to hers. When she finally emerged, clean and wrapped in a borrowed robe Mrs. Fernandez had provided, she discovered a package on the bed that hadn't been there before. Inside was a simple but elegant blue dress, clearly new but in a practical style suitable for a court appearance. A note in unfamiliar handwriting accompanied it. "Miss O'Sullivan, please accept this small gift to replace what you had to leave behind. A lady should not have to face a judge in travel-worn attire. With respect, Malcolm Hayes." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Marianne deeply. She had indeed been concerned about appearing in court in her dusty riding clothes, but had been too preoccupied with larger worries to mention it. She was just finishing dressing when a knock came at her door. Opening it cautiously, she found Zach waiting, similarly refreshed and wearing what appeared to be a new shirt and vest. "Hayes," he explained, gesturing to his attire with a slightly self-conscious shrug. "Said I couldn't represent you properly looking like a trail hand." "He brought me a dress as well," Marianne said, stepping back to let Zach enter. "He seems to have thought of everything." "That's Malcolm," Zach agreed. "Always 3 steps ahead." He paused, taking in her appearance. "You look very nice." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "So do you. Almost respectable." He laughed at that, the tension between them easing somewhat. "Don't get used to it. Back at the ranch, it's just me and the cattle, not much call for fancy duds." The mention of the ranch brought a sudden pang to Marianne's heart. In all the chaos and fear of the past days, she had somehow begun to think of Zach's small homestead as a place of safety, almost as a home. The realization that she might never see it again, that after tomorrow, she might need to make her way to Denver or San Francisco, or some other distant place, left her feeling unexpectedly bereft. Before she could dwell on this, another knock announced Hayes's arrival. The lawyer entered with an armload of documents and a determined expression. "Good evening, both of you. I trust you've had some rest." At their nods, he continued briskly, "Excellent. We have much to discuss before tomorrow's hearing." For the next 2 hours, Hayes walked them through the legal strategy he had developed. The judge would hear testimony from both Marianne and Zach about the events leading up to her flight from Florence and the subsequent pursuit by Blackstone's men. Hayes had also managed to locate 2 other women from Florence who had allegedly suffered at Victor Blackstone's hands and were willing to testify to his character. "The judge has granted us a closed hearing," Hayes explained. "Only those directly involved will be present. This protects Miss O'Sullivan's privacy and prevents any intimidation by Blackstone supporters." "Will Victor be there?" Marianne asked, unable to keep the apprehension from her voice. "He has been summoned to appear or send legal representation," Hayes confirmed. "It's his right to face his accuser, but the judge will ensure he maintains a respectful distance and court officers will be present at all times." Marianne nodded, steeling herself for the confrontation. "What will I need to say?" "The truth," Hayes said simply. "In as much detail as you can recall. The judge will want to hear about the arrangement between your father and Harrison Blackstone, Victor's behavior toward you, and the circumstances of your departure from Florence." "And my involvement?" Zach asked. "You will testify to finding Miss O'Sullivan in distress, the visible evidence of assault, and the subsequent pursuit by Blackstone's men. Your testimony corroborates her account and establishes the ongoing threat to her safety." Hayes shuffled through his papers. "I should mention that I've taken the liberty of filing a counter-complaint regarding the damage to your property over the past years. The 2 cases are naturally connected, as they demonstrate a pattern of intimidation and unlawful conduct by the Blackstone family." "Is that wise?" Zach questioned. "Won't it complicate matters?" "On the contrary," Hayes replied. "It strengthens our position by showing that this isn't an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of behavior. Judge McAllister is particularly interested in cases where wealthy individuals attempt to circumvent the law through intimidation or violence." The discussion continued until well after dark, with Hayes methodically addressing every aspect of the upcoming hearing. By the time he gathered his papers to leave, Marianne felt simultaneously more prepared and more anxious about what lay ahead. "Try to get some sleep," Hayes advised as he departed. "The hearing is set for 9 o'clock. I'll come for you at 8:30. When the door closed behind him, Marianne sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what tomorrow would bring. "I'm not sure I can do this," she admitted softly. "Face Victor, tell my story to a roomful of strangers." Zach knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You can," he said with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than you know, Marianne, and you won't be alone. I'll be right there with you." She looked into his eyes, drawing strength from the unwavering faith she saw there. "Promise?" "I promise." He squeezed her hands gently before releasing them and rising to his feet. "Now try to rest. Tomorrow is a new beginning, whatever happens." After he left, Marianne lay awake for a long time, her mind racing with thoughts of the hearing and what might follow. When she finally did sleep, her dreams were not of pursuit or fear, but of a small ranch nestled against cottonwood trees, and a man with kind eyes who had shown her what true strength looked like. The territorial courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white trim, one of the few buildings in Tucson constructed in the Eastern style rather than the local adobe. As Hayes led them up the broad steps the next morning, Marianne felt as though every eye in the street was upon them, though in reality few people paid them any attention. Inside, the building was cool and quiet, their footsteps echoing on marble floors as Hayes guided them to a small courtroom on the second floor. Two women were already seated on a bench outside the door, both appearing nervous but determined. "Miss O'Sullivan," Hayes said, "these are the witnesses I mentioned, Mrs. Alina Weber and Miss Sarah Jenkins. They've traveled from Florence at considerable personal risk to testify today." Marianne approached them with a sense of both gratitude and guilt. "Thank you for coming," she said sincerely. "I'm sorry to have involved you in my troubles." "They were already our troubles too," the older woman, Mrs. Weber, replied with a grim smile. "Victor Blackstone has cast a long shadow over Florence for years. It's time someone stood against him." Before Marianne could respond, the courtroom door opened and a bailiff appeared. "Judge McAllister will see you now," he announced. The courtroom was smaller and less formal than Marianne had imagined, with simple wooden furnishings and tall windows that allowed morning light to stream in. A middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed white beard sat behind the raised desk at the front, reviewing documents with a focused expression. And there, seated at a table to one side with a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, was Victor Blackstone himself. He looked up as they entered, his gaze finding Marianne immediately. The naked malice in his eyes made her falter mid-step. Zach's hand came to the small of her back, a gentle pressure that steadied her without drawing attention. "I'm right here," he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. Drawing strength from his presence, Marianne straightened her spine and walked forward, refusing to show fear. Judge McAllister looked up as they approached the tables at the front of the room. "Mr. Hayes," he acknowledged, "I've reviewed your filings. Most unusual circumstances." "Indeed, Your Honor," Hayes agreed, "but most serious as well, so I gather." The judge's keen eyes shifted to Marianne. "Miss O'Sullivan, I presume?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "And Mr. Griffith." The judge nodded to Zach, who confirmed his identity with a respectful "Your Honor." "Very well. Let's proceed." McAllister turned to the other table. "Mr. Blackstone, Mr. Harrington. We'll hear all sides today, but I want to be clear from the outset this court will not tolerate any attempts at intimidation or disruption." "Is that understood?" "Of course, Your Honor," the lawyer, Harrington, answered smoothly. Victor merely nodded, his expression impassive save for the cold anger in his eyes. The hearing proceeded with a formality that Marianne found oddly comforting. Hayes presented their case clearly and methodically, first calling Marianne to testify about the arrangement between her father and Harrison Blackstone, the increasingly controlling behavior Victor had exhibited during their engagement, and finally, the physical assault that had precipitated her flight. "And this occurred on the morning of your intended wedding?" Judge McAllister asked, when she had finished describing how Victor had struck her when she questioned a clause in the marriage contract. "Yes, Your Honor," Marianne confirmed. "I had never seen that side of him before that day, though I had heard rumors." "What sort of rumors, Miss O'Sullivan?" Marianne hesitated, glancing at Victor, whose expression had grown thunderous. "That he had a temper, Your Honor, that other women had, suffered for it." Victor's lawyer rose at this. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay and speculation." "Sustained," McAllister agreed. "Miss O'Sullivan, please confine your testimony to events you personally witnessed or experienced." His tone was gentle despite the admonition. "Now, please continue. What happened after Mr. Blackstone struck you?" Marianne described her escape through the back streets of Florence, her chance encounter with Zach, and his offer of sanctuary at his ranch. When she reached the part about the pursuit by Blackstone's men and the gunfight near Tucson, the judge's expression grew increasingly grave. "These are serious allegations, Miss O'Sullivan," he said when she had finished. "Mr. Blackstone, you'll have the opportunity to respond after we've heard from all the witnesses. Mr. Hayes, please call your next witness." Zach's testimony corroborated Marianne's account, adding details about the damage to his own property over the years that he attributed to Harrison Blackstone's attempts to force him to sell. When he described finding Marianne in the alley with a split lip and terror in her eyes, his voice took on an edge of controlled anger that made the judge study him thoughtfully. Mrs. Weber and Miss Jenkins followed, each recounting their own experiences with Victor Blackstone's temper and inappropriate behavior. Sarah Jenkins, a young woman who had worked as a maid in the Blackstone household, trembled visibly as she described how Victor had cornered her in a hallway, his unwanted advances turning to threats when she rejected him. "He said no one would believe me over him," she told the court, her voice barely above a whisper, "and that my family would suffer if I spoke a word against him." By the time all the testimony had been presented, the morning had stretched into afternoon, and the judge called for a brief recess before hearing from the Blackstone side. As they waited in an antechamber, Marianne felt drained but strangely liberated. Whatever happened next, her story had been told and heard by someone with the power to help. "You did wonderfully," Zach assured her, bringing her a cup of water. Hayes says the judge seemed genuinely concerned by the testimony. "What happens now?" Marianne asked, sipping the water gratefully. "Now Blackstone and his lawyer will attempt to discredit everything we've said," Hayes answered frankly, joining their conversation. "They'll portray you as a hysterical woman who broke a legitimate contract, and Mr. Griffith as an opportunist with a grudge against the Blackstone family. They'll likely imply that your relationship is improper." Marianne felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication. "But that's not, the truth is less important to them than creating doubt," Hayes interrupted gently. "But Judge McAllister is no fool. He's seen this tactic before and knows how to weigh evidence properly." When the court reconvened, Victor Blackstone took the stand, presenting himself as a respected businessman blindsided by his fiancée's inexplicable flight on their wedding day. He denied striking Marianne, suggesting she had injured herself in a fall and used it as an excuse to flee a marriage she had agreed to but later regretted. "Miss O'Sullivan was always high-strung and fanciful," Victor told the judge with an expression of pained concern. "I believed she simply had wedding nerves. When she disappeared, I was frantic with worry. The search parties were not pursuing her, Your Honor, but searching for a missing woman I feared had come to harm." "And the gunfight near Tucson?" Judge McAllister asked skeptically. "How do you explain that, Mr. Blackstone?" "My men reported that Griffith fired first," Victor replied smoothly. "They were simply defending themselves while trying to ensure Miss O'Sullivan's safety." The questioning continued for another hour, with Harrington presenting documents showing the legal arrangement between Harrison Blackstone and Marianne's father, attempting to establish the legitimacy of the marriage contract. He portrayed Zach as a bitter rival with financial motives for interfering, and suggested that Mrs. Weber and Miss Jenkins had personal grievances that colored their testimony. Throughout it all, Judge McAllister listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by the Blackstone version of events. When both sides had presented their cases, he called for final statements from each. Harrington spoke first, his voice resonant with practiced persuasion. "Your Honor, what we have here is a simple case of a young woman experiencing cold feet before her wedding, and a neighbor with a long-standing grudge against her fiancé's family taking advantage of the situation. The marriage contract between Miss O'Sullivan and Mr. Blackstone is legally binding, entered into by her father of his own free will. We ask that you uphold the law and the sanctity of contracts by ordering Miss O'Sullivan to honor her obligations." Hayes rose next, his manner less theatrical but no less compelling. "Your Honor, this case is not about contracts but about basic human dignity and safety. Miss O'Sullivan fled not from legally binding obligations, but from imminent danger. The testimony you've heard today establishes a clear pattern of intimidation and violence by Victor Blackstone, a pattern that extends beyond Miss O'Sullivan to other women, and to property owners who stand in the way of Blackstone business interests. We ask that you void this so-called marriage contract as having been obtained under duress, and that you grant Miss O'Sullivan protection from further harassment or coercion by the Blackstone family." Judge McAllister considered both statements, then announced he would retire to his chambers to review the evidence before rendering a decision. "This court will reconvene at 4 o'clock, he declared, rising from the bench. The next 2 hours passed with excruciating slowness for Marianne. She, Zach, and Hayes remained in the courthouse, none of them wanting to risk an encounter with Victor on the streets of Tucson. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts about what the judge's decision might mean for their futures. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, Marianne's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She took her place beside Hayes at their table, aware of Victor's cold gaze from across the room, but refusing to meet it. Judge McAllister entered and took his seat, his expression giving no hint of his decision. He shuffled the papers before him, then looked up to address the room. "I have considered the testimony and evidence presented today with great care," he began. "This case touches on matters that go beyond simple contract law to the very foundations of justice and personal liberty in our territory." He turned his attention to Victor. "Mr. Blackstone, this court finds your account of events to be inconsistent and contradicted by multiple witnesses. The pattern of behavior described by Miss O'Sullivan, Mr. Griffith, and the other witnesses suggests a troubling disregard for both the law and the well-being of others." A surge of hope rose in Marianne's chest as the judge continued. "As to the marriage contract itself, I find that it was indeed secured under circumstances that constitute duress. Mr. O'Sullivan's financial obligations to Harrison Blackstone created a situation in which his consent to the arrangement cannot be considered truly voluntary. Furthermore, the evidence of physical assault prior to the wedding provides additional grounds for voiding such an agreement." McAllister paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling on Marianne. "Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the marriage contract between Miss Marianne O'Sullivan and Mr. Victor Blackstone is null and void. Miss O'Sullivan has no legal obligation to enter into marriage with Mr. Blackstone or to return to Florence against her will." Relief washed over Marianne like a cool wave, but the judge wasn't finished. "Additionally, this court issues a restraining order prohibiting Victor Blackstone, his employees or agents from approaching, contacting, or otherwise harassing Miss O'Sullivan. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution." He turned to Zach. Mr. Griffith, while your actions in assisting Miss O'Sullivan were admirable, I must caution against taking the law into your own hands in the future. The proper recourse would have been to bring Miss O'Sullivan directly to the authorities. Yes, Your Honor, Zach acknowledged, though Marianne could tell from his expression that he had no regrets about the course they had taken. As to the matter of damages to Mr. Griffith's property, the judge continued, I find sufficient evidence to warrant further investigation. The Territorial Marshal's office will look into these allegations, and Harrison Blackstone will be summoned to answer questions regarding his business practices in Florence and the surrounding county. With a final rap of his gavel, Judge McAllister concluded, This hearing is adjourned. Miss O'Sullivan, you are free to go wherever you choose. Free. The word echoed in Marianne's mind as the courtroom began to empty. Free to go wherever she chose to live as she wished, to build a future of her own making. The enormity of it left her momentarily speechless. Hayes was the first to break the silence, gathering his papers with a satisfied expression. A complete victory, he declared. I suspected McAllister would see through Blackstone's performance, but even I didn't expect such a comprehensive ruling. Marianne found her voice at last. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done. No repayment necessary, my dear, Hayes assured her. Standing against the Blackstone family's overreach has been a personal mission of mine for some time. Your case has provided an opportunity to finally begin holding them accountable. As they rose to leave, Marianne became aware of Victor still seated at the other table, his lawyer speaking urgently in his ear. When Victor looked up, the hatred in his eyes sent a chill through her despite the judge's ruling. Don't worry, Zach said softly, noticing her reaction. He won't try anything here, and the restraining order will keep him at a distance. For now, Marianne replied, unable to shake the feeling that Victor Blackstone was not a man who accepted defeat easily. They had just reached the courthouse steps when Victor's voice called from behind them. This isn't over, O'Sullivan. They turned to find him standing in the doorway, his face contorted with rage despite his lawyer's attempts to quiet him. You've made a fool of me in front of the whole territory, he continued, ignoring the growing crowd of onlookers. You'll regret that, both of you will. Before anyone could respond, 2 court officers appeared beside Victor, gripping his arms firmly. Mr. Blackstone, one said, threatening Miss O'Sullivan directly contradicts the judge's restraining order. You'll need to come with us. As Victor was led back inside, still hurling threats and obscenities, Hayes shook his head in disgust. Some men never learn, he remarked, but his outburst may have done us a favor. Violating a restraining order within minutes of its issuance won't endear him to Judge McAllister. They made their way back to the Cosmopolitan Hotel, where Mrs. Fernandez greeted the news of their legal victory with genuine pleasure. I have prepared a special dinner to celebrate, she announced, in the private dining room where you will not be disturbed. As Marianne changed for dinner, replacing the court dress with a simpler one Mrs. Fernandez had provided, she found herself facing the question that had hovered at the edges of her mind throughout the hearing. What now? Where would she go? What would she do with the freedom she had fought so hard to win? And perhaps most pressingly, what about Zach? The man who had risked everything to help her, who had shown her kindness without expectation, whose presence had somehow become as necessary to her as breathing. The private dining room was intimate, with a single table set for 3 and candles casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Hayes joined them for the meal, raising a toast to justice served and freedom won. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from Hayes's other cases to Zach's plans for expanding his herd. carefully avoiding the one subject that hung unspoken between them: Marianne's plans for the future. When Hayes finally took his leave, promising to meet them the following morning to discuss any remaining legal matters, an expectant silence fell between the two left at the table. Marianne traced the rim of her wineglass, gathering her courage for the conversation she knew they needed to have. "Zach," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happens next." "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "I could go to Denver to my aunt, or perhaps San Francisco, where my brother might help me find suitable employment." "Both good options," Zach acknowledged, though something in his expression suggested he found neither particularly appealing. "You have choices now, real ones like I promised." "Yes," Marianne agreed softly, "and that's because of you." She took a deep breath, then continued with more confidence. "But there's another option I've been considering. One that feels right somehow." "Oh," Zach's tone remained casual, but she noticed his hands tighten slightly on the tablecloth. "I could return to Florence," Marianne said, watching his reaction closely. "Not to the town itself, perhaps, but to the area, to a certain small ranch with a very loyal dog and a view of the mountains that takes my breath away." Hope flickered across Zach's face, quickly masked by uncertainty. "As my housekeeper?" he asked, echoing their earlier conversation. "No," Marianne replied firmly. "Not as your housekeeper, as your partner, your equal, your—" She hesitated, then finished simply, "your wife, if you'll have me." For a moment, Zach seemed unable to speak, his expression shifting from disbelief to cautious joy. "Marianne," he finally managed, "are you certain? After everything you've been through, I wouldn't want you to feel obligated, or—" "I've never been more certain of anything," she interrupted. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation or gratitude, though I am grateful, more than I can express. But this," she reached across the table to take his hand, "this is about two people who found each other against all odds, who bring out the best in each other, who face danger and uncertainty together and come out stronger for it." Zach's fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. "I've loved you since that first night at the ranch," he admitted quietly. "When you insisted on helping with dinner, even after everything you'd been through, your spirit, your courage, your kindness, they humbled me then and they humble me now. Is that a yes?" Marianne asked, her heart so full she thought it might burst. In answer, Zach rose from his chair and came around the table, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. "It's a yes," he whispered, before lowering his mouth to hers in a kiss that conveyed everything words could not: tenderness and passion, promise and devotion, a future unfolding before them like the wide Arizona sky. When they finally parted, Marianne rested her forehead against his, a smile of pure happiness curving her lips. "So, Zachary Griffith," she murmured, "when shall we go home?" 2 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Marianne O'Sullivan became Marianne Griffith in a simple ceremony performed by Judge McAllister himself, who had traveled to Florence specifically for the occasion. The wedding took place not in town, where the Blackstone shadow still loomed large, but at the ranch, beneath the cottonwood trees that had witnessed the beginning of their journey together. Hayes served as Zach's best man, while Mrs. Weber and Sarah Jenkins stood with Marianne. A handful of neighboring ranchers attended, along with Mrs. Fernandez from Tucson, and to Marianne's surprise and joy, her mother, who had traveled from Denver after receiving Marianne's letter explaining everything that had transpired. "I never wanted that match for you, Mrs. O'Sullivan had confessed upon arriving at the ranch, but I felt bound by your father's arrangement. I should have had the courage to stand against it." Her gaze had moved to Zach, who was busy preparing the ranch for the wedding guests. This man truly loves you." "With all his heart," Marianne had assured her, "as I love him." "Then I am content," her mother had declared, embracing her for the first time in what felt like years. Now, as Marianne spoke her vows beneath the dappled shade of the cottonwoods, Duke lying contentedly at their feet, she felt a sense of completion that went beyond the ceremony itself. This was not an ending but a beginning one she had chosen freely, with clear eyes and a full heart. The months that followed brought changes to the ranch and to Florence itself. The territorial marshal's investigation into Harrison Blackstone's business practices revealed widespread corruption and intimidation, leading to multiple indictments and the eventual dissolution of the Blackstone empire in the Arizona Territory. Victor had fled to California rather than face charges for violating the restraining order and other, more serious offenses that came to light during the investigation. With the Blackstone influence waning, Florence began to transform. Smaller businesses flourished, and a new sense of optimism took hold in the community. The O'Sullivan mine, which had been seized by Harrison Blackstone when Samuel O'Sullivan died, was returned to Marianne's family as part of the legal settlements. Under her direction, with Zach's support, it was reopened on a smaller scale, providing employment for many in the area and a steady income that allowed them to expand the ranch operations. By the time their first anniversary approached, Marianne and Zach had built a life together that neither could have imagined on that fateful night when she fled down an alleyway with nothing but a small satchel and desperate courage. Their partnership extended to every aspect of ranch life, with Marianne discovering an aptitude for breeding and training horses that complemented Zach's skill with cattle. On the evening of their anniversary, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, watching the sunset paint the western sky. Duke dozed at their feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on the newest addition to the family, a copper-haired infant boy named Samuel, after Marianne's father, sleeping peacefully in Zach's arms. "Happy?" Zach asked, his gaze moving from the horizon to his wife's face. "Beyond words," Marianne replied, reaching out to smooth a strand of their son's fine hair. "Though I still can't quite believe how much has changed in a single year." "For the better, I hope," Zach said, his tone light but his eyes searching hers. In answer, Marianne leaned over to kiss him, gentle but thorough. "For the better in every way," she assured him when they parted. "I wouldn't change a single step of the journey that brought us here." As darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, Marianne thought back to that desperate woman who had fled an arranged marriage to a cruel man, and the cowboy who had hidden her until she could choose her own path. The road had been dangerous, the outcome uncertain, but the journey had led to this moment, this perfect, ordinary moment of family and home and love freely given and received. And as Zach carried their sleeping son inside, Marianne followed, stepping willingly into the future they had built together, one choice at a time.